I have everything set up in OBS, so hopefully video and everything will be there for you guys in YouTube afterwards. I'll update you on how that goes afterwards. But thank you guys for being here. Honestly, I'm really excited for today. I think we've made a lot of progress that most of you guys have kind of seen a little bits of, shared to Twitter and things like that. But we're definitely going to dive into it. So first off, just a few community updates and reminders for everyone here and hopefully everyone who watches later, and the announcement I'll make in Discord afterwards. The ACC ends this May, or at the end of May here. So you guys have about another 2 weeks or so to get your submissions in. Whether that be lore, development projects, art, whatever it might be. Broad spectrum of things are accepted, and if you want to participate, make sure you go check out that ACC wiki page. That'll give you all the details. And if you don't know where that is, I'm happy to share the link there in the announcement that I'll put out a little bit later. Then moving on to the next piece is the community survey. I know we all love community surveys. We get them in our email a million times every week, but they really do help. So if anyone here hasn't already taken the survey and is willing to, please, we encourage you to do that, and you'll also be entered to win some cool prizes, hats, shirt, things like that. So that is basically the what I need to announce here in terms of just kind of reminders. But today we're really going to be diving into what Proto, Darkos, and Sergey have all been working on, and that is production chains, travel, and the vast amount of UI that is still yet to be seen by most of you guys. So I think to start it off, Chris, why don't you just dive into what you've been working on the development side, where you see things are, and what we can look forward to.
Sure. So we've been pretty actively focused on travel, as well as being pretty focused on this Cairo 0 to Cairo 1 transition. So one of the last pieces after a pretty substantial majority of our code had been converted was to build out the last of our libraries, and that was around travel. So pretty excited that that's finished and all in Cairo 1 and ready to go. We are now able to verify trajectories on chain. I think it's pretty awesome. We've got all of the realistic orbital mechanics occurring on chain. When it comes to validating routes, we can ensure that a submitted route solution is accurate to within 1/100,000th of the trip time. So that's pretty exciting. Same deal with the destination and origin locations. So we can be very confident that players are submitting trajectory solutions that are accurate. And all for, I think, a fairly reasonable computation cost on chain. It's really exciting, very nerdy, but powers, I think, like the core of Influence. So I'm really excited that that's finished. And then, of course, we've been working on actually surfacing all of that in the UI. That's pieces of what you've seen already. So that's a pretty major focus, is kind of nailing down the travel system game, how you get to other asteroids, how you pick the ideal route, whether you're trying to go for efficiency with gas or speed, letting you pick those fairly easily and giving you a lot of information about what that actually means and what situation you'll be in when you end up at your destination. So I think that's coming along really, really well. It's incredibly exciting for me to see that live and working, because again, I think it is really the core of Influence. It's one of, I think, the most unique features about the game, having this dynamic orbital system with a large number of players all playing in the same system. So I'm super excited to see it. Things are moving along quite well. I would say the other main area of focus when it comes to development is really pushing on our partners, specifically our wallet partners, to really make sure that we have a great onboarding experience for regular gamers, for gamers who are not in any way familiar with crypto, or maybe even have a negative opinion of crypto. Really giving them an experience that feels smooth and feels like, just like any other game, and sort of surfacing the benefits that they're getting from blockchain a little bit more slowly as they start to get excited and really stuck into playing Influence. And that's moving along well. So yeah, those are our main focuses at the moment.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think that can't be understated in terms
JP?
of. Hey, can you hear me?
Uh-oh. Did his
Oh no.
recording software mute him again?
Hey, can you hear me?
So while Darkos was talking, I was just wanted to say I was silently cheering
Hey, can you hear me?
Demo of the routing
Check,
stuff.
check.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I don't know if we want
can do
to.
that. We've all had.
Yeah.
It was one of the coolest things I have.
Hey, can you hear me?
That I've seen in a game in a while.
Hear you,
Hey,
JP.
JP, we can hear you now.
Okay, yeah. But yeah, sorry. I was listening to all that. Just feel free to jump right in.
So yeah, we're gonna.
There's only a few folks here, but if you want a demo, I think this is going to be a pretty special moment.
Yeah. So just FYI, sorry, as soon as you get the video up, I need to adjust the recording for the screen properly. So if you could just take like 15 seconds before moving to like multiple different screens, that would be awesome. So I can kind of freeze the frame.
Well, sorry, I was under the impression Chris was going to demo.
Oh, sorry.
I don't have anything ready, and maybe we're not prepared to. We didn't do
No.
Here. We're just doing this live.
I think I just missed
No, I'm
like
happy
10
to give an
seconds.
ad hoc. I'm happy to give an ad hoc demo. We can do that now.
So
Now a good
let's
time?
let's
Or do you wanna do
save it.
some-
Let's run through kind of everything and then do the demo towards the back, and then we can move into questions. So maybe we can. Sorry, I missed maybe 10, 15 seconds of the conversation. Sergey, were you finished with your update?
Yeah, I mean, Chris really covered my update in detail. I don't think there's anything more other than I'm myself and Proto are working on the nuts and bolts of the travel system right now, and I kind of was into the minutia of beyond the really cool 3D routes, which are like a really cool part of the experience. There is the actual setup and the numbers stuff and the stuff that's needed for actual gameplay and all the windows where you submit your actions and stuff like that. So that in a nutshell is what I'm focused on, because last week I was focused on wrapping up the visuals for the cool 3D stuff, which we now can demo, which is the exciting bit.
Yeah, it's very exciting. But thank you. Let's move into Proto, the man, the myth, the legend, the one behind the recipes. Let's hear what you've got.
Sure. I mean, actually, the first thing to talk about is probably not the production chains, but the sort of mechanics discussions that have been going on behind the scenes about travel. Just to sort of cover like what is encompassed by that term a little more broadly. First, like the first and foremost, like the most clear thing, part of travel is going between asteroids, sort of the route planning aspect of that, where you see the pork chop plot that will be demoed in a little bit here, and think about the propellant usage and all that. But there's also some sort of other related things that are actually quite important that we've been very heavily fleshing out the past week or two. So the first of those is the launching and landing of your ship. So, you know, basic mechanic is that you have to be in orbit in order to travel between asteroids. Like you go orbit to orbit, it's never like surface of one asteroid to surface of another asteroid. So basically what you have to do is you have to launch your ship into orbit, and then once you're there, you can plan a trip to go to the orbit of another asteroid. And once you're there, you have to land your ship to do anything on the surface. So we figured out the mechanics pretty well, I think, for launching and landing now. Essentially, you will actually use propellant to launch and land your ship. Just a little bit of it, though. The delta V to actually get off any of these asteroids is quite low, almost nothing on some of the smallest asteroids to get into orbit. especially compared to the delta V for traveling across the belt, which is in the tens of kilometers per second. And I think for AP we're looking at less than 500 meters per second of delta V for launching and landing, and much less for smaller rocks. So, but there is a requirement to do that. And the reason for that is that launching to orbit and landing from orbit is actually very fast. It'll only take a few minutes for your ship to do that, and we'll have in the future post-exploitation we'll have a nice sort of animated screen of your ship lifting off and stuff that you can look at while that's happening. But to start with, we won't have that, but in the future we will. But anyway, it's really quick, and so you can launch to orbit in probably a couple minutes. You can get back from orbit in a couple minutes, but you have to spend a little bit of propellant to do that. And the reason you have to spend propellant is because if you think about surface transport, like moving materials across the surface of an asteroid, it's set up so that it takes a certain amount of time based on the distance between those points. Conceptually, you can picture like a little hopper, one of those automated spacecraft coming and grabbing your cargo and then accelerating up to speed and then decelerating when it gets back to the destination, and that taking a certain amount of time, which we've simplified to be linear with the distance, even though in reality it wouldn't quite be. So if you allowed ships to instantly go to orbit and then instantly land anywhere else on the asteroid, you can realize that would completely break surface transport. It would mean that you could just kind of teleport goods up and down again quickly anywhere for no cost. And so surface transport using the automated approach would be vastly inferior to just having a ship or hiring somebody with a ship to move your goods around much faster. So we didn't want that, and so that's why the propellant costs for your ship launching and landing come in. If you recall, we originally had thought that surface transport with the hoppers would actually cost some hydrolox propellant, which is an old product we don't have anymore. But we got rid of that because we think that being able to just move things around for free slowly is a really good mechanic to sort of help people not have to think as much about the logistics of moving things around. But with ships launching and landing costing propellant, there's now a fast way to do it yourself. If you really want to get goods somewhere halfway across AP really quickly, you can use a little bit of your hydrogen propellant to launch your ship with the cargo in it, to orbit and then land it again. And you can do that in a few minutes total, just with that cost of propellant. If time is really of the essence for you, like if you see a market opportunity or something to cross the asteroid. So we think that's pretty clean. That makes a lot of sense. One implication there is that landing on an asteroid, we don't ever want you to be in a situation where you can't land, because landing, that's where you can refill your ship only on the surface. You can't transfer things in orbit between ships. So if you couldn't land, you'd actually be quite stuck. So there's one enforcement there, which is that anytime you launch off of the surface of an asteroid, and anytime you plan a route to another asteroid, you have to have the amount of propellant left after doing that would enable you to land at the destination of the asteroid that you're going to. So you'll always be able to land. You always have the propellant to do that if you've made it to orbit in the first place. But that's basically how that mechanic will work. And then what we've also been fleshing out related to that is the crew moving around mechanics. I would say this is still a little bit more in flux, but pretty close to being nailed down. Part of this game is managing where your crew is at any time. The location of your crew is really important. Like you want your crew to be close to the action, whatever all the things they're doing. Like the closer they are to where they work, basically, the less they have to commute. I mean, just like in real life. And so it's a very important consideration, like keeping them close to that location. Sometimes they'll be based out of like a habitat. That's sort of the normal case, especially on AP where it's crowded and most people just want to be in habitats close to all the action. Sometimes they'll be in a ship, so you might be in your landed light transport on an empty lot. You might be in your shuttle or your heavy transport on the in a spaceport somewhere, and you can do your work out of that ship just like you could out of a habitat. It's a base. That's where your crew is based out of. And so, needless to say, moving your crew around between different bases is actually a very important mechanic because it really lets you sort of set where your crew is, and it's a logistical thing you want to think about because it lets you optimize your gameplay pretty heavily. And also, it's how you get your crew to different places. So, if you have a crew that's in habitat and you just bought a ship that's sitting empty in a spaceport, okay, now you need to station your crew out of that habitat into the ship if you want to take it off and fly it somewhere. So basically what the mechanics that we've come down here about are that there's station crew, which is an action that you would take with your crew targeting a habitat. So that's when you move into a different habitat from wherever you currently are. And there's station flight crew, which is where your crew is going onto a ship that they own. They're stationing themselves as the flight crew on their own ship. They're taking control of it, taking command of it, and they can fly it at that point if it has propellant. And then there's station passengers, which is basically where you're stationing your crew on somebody else's ship if they've made their ship available for other people to be able to do that. So stationing passengers is, the way you would make a space line or the way that you would use a space line, like sort of like an airline, where you would be able to put your crew on somebody else's ship as a passenger. You can't fly it. You're not the flying crew. They have to fly it, but you're sort of at their mercy at that point. They can fly you wherever they want. And you can always get off again. So if they take you somewhere else, because they said that that's what they're going to do, and maybe you paid them to do that, then you can get off when you're at the destination and jump into whatever habitat or ship that is at that destination that you have available to you. So those are the basic stationing crew mechanics. And the way that works is basically like you can do that on the surface, where your crew moves slowly, like according to sort of the surface transport time between different locations on the asteroid surface, sort of the same amount of time that it would take to move materials with like a hopper, since that's basically what's happening is your crew is in an escape module on a hopper when they're moving around on the surface. They can also move between the surface and orbit in some cases. So if your ship, for example, is empty in orbit, there's a number of cases that could cause that. Then you can actually take your crew from the surface, and they can jump up to orbit into their ship, the one that they own, and do the sort of station flight crew action. It's the same action. So they can do that, jump up to orbit and take command of their ship that way. They can do the inverse. They can jump down from orbit from their ship to whatever habitats or ships they have available to them on the surface. And if you're a passenger, you can do the same. You can jump down from a ship that's in orbit to wherever you want on the surface. You cannot, as a passenger, jump up to a ship in orbit. That has to happen in a spaceport or a landed light transport. You have to do that on the surface. So that's the one thing you can't do as a passenger. You always need to land if you want to be a passenger and get onto a ship. But and the key thing here is that this is actually quite slow. So moving your crew up into orbit and down again, if there's a ship that is available to you up there, is quite slow because otherwise it would again be an exploit where if it was quick, then you could quickly jump up to a ship in orbit and then jump down again to somewhere else to move your crew faster than they could move normally on the surface if they were moving between different points, which is slow because of the hoppers. So again, it's pretty slow. So you'd only do that if you need to, but that's a way you can sort of move your crew around on their own. We've also been talking about
of game design. I'm just gonna hop in here
yeah.
and say, man, this is what the deep down game design discussions that we've been having the last 2 weeks are made of. All these tiny little edge cases.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've never actually shared some of this, and so it's kind of like new information for everybody, which is why I'm going into maybe a little more detail than I would normally, but just sort of showing where we're at, and that these mechanics, which are going to be key to the gameplay, like you'll be doing this quite often, as during the gameplay, that we have thought about how it's going to work and sort of giving you guys a sense of what you'll be doing in the game. I mean, a lot of this flows into Sergey's work with like the UI design. A lot of it is going to flow into the contract work once that's ready to go. So there's just a ton of implications to like figuring this stuff out. And up until this point, we've sort of been able to wave our hands and say, oh, the crew can move around, however they need to. Now it's like, no, here's the actions that you can take and the exact conditions under which you can take them. And we've also, I think I'll not go into as much detail on this, but we've also been working out the escape module mechanics a lot more. Those are pretty close to being nailed down, I think. That especially pertains when your crew gets ejected from a ship that they're in. If you're a passenger and the ship owner ejects you from that ship because for whatever reason, you wind up in orbit in an escape module. If you're in a habitat and you get ejected, then you wind up in orbit in an escape module. If you go to do something from a ship that you're a passenger in, and while you're doing it, they eject you. When you come back, you get sent up to orbit. So there's some situations where you wind up in an escape module. So you'll get more details on that later, I think, once we've finalize that more. And we've also been thinking about ships getting marooned, like what happens then. I think we have a decent package of mechanics that would help you out in that situation. But again, that'll be a little bit more TBD, and I think we can share that a little later down the road. But a ton of hashing out of mechanics going on in the background, and I think Chris, if you feel differently, tell me. But I think I'm feeling pretty happy with how clarified things are at this stage right now. Like they've gone from being sort of a lot of hand wavy kind of just general senses of how things should work to this makes sense, and we've thought about the sort of adversarial, like how can you abuse this? How can we make sure that it isn't abusable? How is it make sure it's balanced? Make sure that it makes sense from a an in-game perspective, like what's actually happening. So just a lot of that kind of work, and very happy with where that's been going and where that's at right now.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It's funny, you end up spending quite a lot of time, an outsized amount of time, kind of working on these edge cases and buttoning them up so that they are not abusable and there's no exploits. But it's definitely important. And yep. I'm also feeling very happy with where we're at.
Yep. And one thing that you're working on, Chris, or will be soon, right, is actually writing out all these mechanics in exhausting detail in a sort of document that we can use to implement from and also eventually share. Is that right?
Yeah, it's getting pretty close to that already. We just have like those a few questions here and there about those kind of extreme edge cases that just need to be filled in. But they're already kind of powering our conversion of Cairo 0 to Cairo 1. So
Awesome.
exciting.
Yeah, I mean, if you guys read the the sort of exploitation guide a while back, like this will be that, but like the actual entire gameplay manual, like in exhausting detail, like all the equations, all the everything
If you want to read through a lot of math, this will be your jam.
Yep.
Yeah. Can I hop in, if I may highlight just for a second, amongst all the things that Noah just discussed in detail, which are going into the game design doc? Just fundamentally, like the thing that impressed me the most about the stuff that we're currently wrapping up is a really, really interesting, I think, player interaction mechanic, unique to on-chain games, but to a lot of games in general, which is we are trying to iron out there's a few cases in which players interact with one another in the game where you own your own assets. You, for the most part, have 100% reign over the lots you control, the asteroids you control, all of this other stuff. They're kind of like yours, but it's a massively multiplayer game. And there's some very interesting parts where player assets will collide with each other. And this is even before conflict. That should be the most interesting part. But here we are talking about specifically, we have lots on the surface. We have ships. When you own your own ships, ships have inventories within them that can contain items. You can load your ship up with stuff, fuel, propellant, cargo. You can also load your ship up with other passengers. Now, if you want to load your ship up with somebody else's cargo, that's going to be a trusting transaction. You're going to have to hammer that out between you and the other player. They will send you their cargo, put it on your ship. It then becomes your cargo. But there's this very unique use case where your ship has a crewmate inventory. You can load it up with whatever crewmates you own, but you can load it up with crewmates that another player owns without transferring ownership, right? You're never, because crewmates are like a special case. The resources in our game are intended to be more fungible and kind of destructible, convertible. But crewmates are forever yours. But there is a very interesting interaction bit that should enable cool stuff in exploitation where you can place your crewmates aboard a ship owned by another person. So you still own your crewmates, they own the ship. And there is a semi-trust relationship where, they're still your crewmates, but you are no longer in control of their location for the duration of, the flight and the duration that they're on their ship. There's a lot of interesting specific UI and kind of like confirmations and stuff that we're sorting out with regards to essentially allowing you to operate ships as a passenger airliner. Like, hey, all aboard! You can welcome aboard crews owned by other people, ferry them to an asteroid of your choosing, but hopefully you agreed upon it, which creates another interesting social situation. And then you will arrive at that asteroid, presumably, dock at the local spaceport, then let the crews off there. And from there, your agreement is concluded. Maybe some payments change place, but then their crews arrive at the new location and can begin doing productive work there based on your transport.
Yep. I mean, that's a key distinction you raised there, which is that cargo in a ship always belongs to the owner of the ship. You can't have somebody else's belongings on your ship in an in-game way. Like you can have belongings that are somebody else's that you have to give back to them, if you want to be a respected member of the community. But it's not like the game knows that those are somebody else's. So if you're hauling cargo for somebody temporarily, it will be yours, and you can choose to give it back to them if you want to be a good person, or you can steal it if you want to be a bad person, and those implications will come back around to you sooner or later. But the passengers on a ship, by contrast, always belong to the owner of that crew. Like the crew, is its own self. You don't own the passengers just because they're on your ship. So they can always leave.
Or not
And, there's a
property.
discussion here of like kidnapping, and yes, you could have people get on your ship and then take them on a long trip that they didn't sign up for, and then they're stuck on there for that long trip. That might be kind of interesting. But as soon as you get to the destination, they can always jump off. If there's somewhere for them to jump off. So,
And that
but
brings us
travel in
around
general is
to
kind of trusted.
emergency. Yeah, precisely. Emergency mechanics of, if that trust is broken and your crew happens to, I don't know, be whisked somewhere that you did not intend, or because somebody wanted to take advantage of you, we're building in, kind of emergency mode transport that will eventually, you can never be 100% marooned as a crew. They'll
Yeah.
be able to find their way back home.
Something that I also just want to point out, because I play a lot of board games, I think most of us probably do here, and you typically, with larger games or complex games, a rule or two may be kind of unclear. And you go to the forums and you're like, oh, just do this instead. When you're building a video game, like, you don't have that ability. So you have to pay attention to edge cases and really think through them. And it's quite inspiring to see be part of these conversations and hear everyone think about these edge cases. And honestly, the community's been doing a pretty good job of asking tough questions too. That has led to some pretty great conversations between the team. So where we're at right now is really exciting, and it's been a mountain of work for everyone to kind of get to this point, but it's starting to unfold quite quickly, and I think most of you guys have started to see that, and we're really excited about showing more.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't.
Yeah, it's
I
hard
also,
to overstate how much work is happening in the background right now. So much is going on. Things are really quiet, and I think that's good, so we can get stuff done. But that doesn't mean nothing's happening.
Yeah, and I was just gonna make a cheeky comment of, I don't know if you've ever played a board game that has like a rule book with an extensive glossary at the very end to cover those edge cases, but it kind of applies to board games too.
Yeah,
Yep. And one thing I
absolutely.
cannot wait for testnet to get some of these mechanics out in front of you guys is for you all to find all those edge cases that we didn't notice, because I mean we're doing our very best to find them all and plan for elegant solutions to them now, but inevitably there'll be some that probably slip through the cracks, and you're gonna wind up getting your passenger stuck between two habitats, both of which got deleted while they were doing it. It's like there's always going to be something that happened that we didn't think of, and I can't wait for you guys to find them so that we can figure out how to fix them and also laugh at how hilarious those cases are.
Yeah. So this might be a good opportunity. Did you want to maybe talk a little bit about the production chains, recipes, and where you're at, Proto?
Sure. I mean, the current state there is that I mean, I sound like a broken record every time I talk about this, but I've been working on the recipes for specifically the refinery processes in our giant production chains spreadsheet, finding the amounts that go into each process and the amounts that come out again. And that's been a lot of chemistry. It's been a lot of, uh, balancing chemical equations and making sure that they match more or less the industrial processes that are actually used to produce those particular products. Um, I'm very close to being done with the refinery recipes and being able to move on to the other buildings, which are a lot easier to sort of just make up numbers. I mean, I won't say make up, but like to find numbers that make sense, but you don't have to like actually do a bunch of chemistry math to validate them. It's just like, okay, that sounds plausible, good enough, moving on. So those will be going a lot quicker. Um, One interesting thing is that as I've been doing these, basically chemical equations for each of the refinery processes to understand how much of each input and how much of each output is required, it really exposes some interesting, in some cases, mistakes that I made earlier when I was like designing the chain. I sort of read a Wikipedia article, read some, articles about sort of how something happens industrially, and penciled in some products that I thought went into it and that would come out of it and seemed plausible. Then you get down to the nitty gritty of the chemical details, and you realize that, oh, I was missing some important reactants, or oh, this is actually an oxide rather than a raw metal. I just realized that for the neodymium, yttrium, aluminum, garnet laser rods, which is an important component of lasers, which have several applications in the game. Um, Basically, I thought they were just made out of neodymium and yttrium and aluminum and some oxygen. That was what you would put into it. So you'd need to like. So I designed these like extensive production chains where here's how you refine yttrium oxide. You have to get it into a fluoride, and then you take the yttrium fluoride, and then you can reduce it down to the pure metal by this process. So, as I designed this process to get the pure yttrium metal, and then I go back, yesterday and like I'm looking into the laser rods and it's like, oh, these actually take oxides to make the laser rod. Like the Chrysokalsi process that produces the crystal is actually just you melt a bunch of oxides together, and that's the mother liquid that it comes from, which means that the entire chain to get yttrium, that was the only thing I was using yttrium for was for that, that laser crystal. So it turns out I didn't need some of those processes at all to produce that. I could have just started from the raw oxide and gone from there. So things like that get turned up when I actually get down into the real chemistry of, oh, these are oxides, not metals or whatever I find there, which has been just really interesting. And I think overall it's making the processes so much richer, and like, they'll really stand up to, I think, some interrogation by people who know what they're talking about. And I'm sure I've made some errors here and there, but like they will be interesting. They're not just be like, oh, I made those numbers up, moving on. It'll be like there's a reason why the numbers are what they are, and we can certainly dive into those if anybody is ever curious about why that is. So pretty excited by that. But I'll also be moving on from that pretty soon and into some other types of production chain recipes.
So I think we'll have plenty of time for questions towards the back half of this conversation. Chris, do you want to do a share right now?
Yeah, give me just a second. I'll do that.
Yep, I got to get the video recording as well.
While we're setting this up, oh, there it is. Oh, I was gonna say, imagine the scene from The Expanse, where they're hunting down the location of the ship.
So Chris is sharing his screen now, so make sure you open that stream up, everyone.
Yep. You guys can all see this?
Looks good to me.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
I can see it. I'm just getting it in frame now.
Keep in mind, this is very much work in progress. We don't have crew images right now, and there are several things that are not connected. But the main focus of this build has been to work through the travel. So what you're seeing now is just sort of the standard system view that you've seen before. I've got the ship. My crew is at Adalia Prime, and I own this asteroid over here, which is TN28453. I have not named it. And I'm going to go ahead and figure out how I might get to, if I were there, how I might get back to Adalia Prime, right? So I go down to plan flight. I'm going to type in Adalia Prime, which will autocomplete. It's going to put me into this route planning view. And right away you see that there's a pork chop plot that is generated. And this gives you an idea of the sort of relative time along the x-axis is how long you would have to wait to leave from Adalia Prime, and along the y-axis is how long the actual trip itself is. So you can imagine sort of down here at the bottom left would be the fastest possible trip in absolute time, and at the very top right would be the slowest. As I start to click around, you can get a feel for these trips. You'll see in the UI there's sort of this this more prominent, brighter green section of the orbit that shows you how long I would be waiting until I left. And actually, sorry, I'm leaving from here. So you're seeing the directionality of the trajectory, the distance of the trajectory, and where Adalia Prime will be when I arrive in the future. In this case, 364 hours in the future. And you can see in looking at the pork chop plot very quickly that this gradient tends towards kind of getting your attention towards the most efficient route. So this pink, the more bright pink color you see, the less propellant will be required. And in this case, I'm using 45% of my propellant, which you can also see up here. And so I'm preserving. I'm sort of preserving propellant so that I can get to my destination slowly, but have more propellant remaining at the end. If you want to go fast, you're generally going to just be looking for this lowest bottom left point. You can see that the trajectory changes pretty significantly. It's much straighter. It's clearly You're clearly using more thrust to get there faster. And again, you're seeing this sort of indication of the weight. So here's where the asteroid I'm leaving from the origin was right now. You're seeing this delay until I leave. The trip then to Adalia Prime, and the distance that Adalia Prime will move between when I leave or I guess between now and when I arrive. So there's a lot of information there and a lot of ability to kind of jump around this pork chop chart and get an idea of all of the different trade-offs. You'll see now I'm using almost all of the propellant in the tank, 96%. And in fact, this line separation between where it's blue and where it's black, which will give you a not possible trajectory, is the 100% propellant line. And so you can really tweak this pretty carefully to orient your trips around when it is best to arrive, using the least propellant or trying to get there as quickly as possible. Furthermore, like there's a lot of ability to tweak this information, so we can simulate a lower loading factor, basically less payload. We can simulate bringing more propellant, and you can sort of imagine that in this scenario, when you're bringing much more propellant and less cargo, you can get to your destination even faster. Kind of faster and faster. Of course, sort of one of the unique factors here in that these are using actual profit equation means sometimes bringing less propellant gets you a much more efficient route, because it actually acts such that any of this propellant that is that you're adding, the more propellant you use, the more expensive it is to move it. That the most efficient propellant you have is actually like the last little bit in the ship that is able to push you the furthest. So I think that this is really giving a ton of information. But I'd love, Sergey, if you want to talk a little bit about some of these design choices. I think that it's been a really interesting iterative approach to building this out.
Yeah, sure thing. What can I cover? There's a lot. There's a lot here, and there's a lot that I would love to get community feedback on. And it's just really cool what's been built in such a short amount of time. But the whole, the part that to me, okay, I guess the most visceral part of this whole experience is as you're doing it right now. Like you can see that there's an arc, and it is calculating a route in 3D, and it is calculating that route not based on some like fake stuff. It is calculating it based on real orbital dynamics. This is the first time, like I've not seen a game actually do this, outside of, probably Kerbal Space Program. But Kerbal Space Program only had a handful of destinations that you could launch between. And here we're calculating this dynamically between 250,000 different asteroids. Every 2 asteroids you pick will have a different graph, and depending on the time that you arrive, because we're only allowing flights within that last based on the ship kind of like tank capacity and stuff like that, flights last a maximum 2 weeks. But of course the asteroids in the belt orbit a little bit slower than that. So basically it's none of these graphs are going to be like one another. Every single day you log into the game, you are going to get a slightly different graph because everything will have moved. And this graph represents an amazingly dense piece of information regarding helping you figure out, hey, how quickly can I get from point A to point B, and what's it going to cost? And both of those factors are going to be dynamic day to day, like hour to hour, really, depending on when you log in. And being able to visualize that and kind of twirl it around in 3D is, for me, what like sci-fi dreams are made of. Like this is the real thing when the Expanse was doing that, they have the like hologram, route calculator where they're trying to like figure out where the spaceships are and what the optimal loop is to go get to places. This is that in real time, and this is a simulator. That's another thing that just to kind of like emphasize that. So like we're working on in the back end right now, like what it means to actually launch the ship. So that ship will actually launch along that route. And like hopefully it'll be cool. You like track it, so as it like travels along the arc. But these trips will, um, according to real orbital dynamics, it will take days, sometimes weeks, because these distances are vast, as we're talking about. Like, actually, there you can even see it lists the astronomical units crossed as part of that journey. So you're looking at a journey of 3.35 AUs there. That's going to take whatever, 2 real world days to cross.
Potentially, it would be kind of fun, Chris, if you could maybe share a little bit about the pork chop chart. Like, what is this information? These are relatively new. I mean, I didn't know they existed until 6 months ago, so it might be good to just kind of cover how they work.
Yeah. So this is actually how NASA plans flights. It's how SpaceX plans flights, transfers, especially between. I mean, if you go look online, you'll see pork chop plots for Earth to Mars transfers. They look very similar to this. And effectively what it is it's showing you, in our case, we've mapped it to the percentage of propellant available to you in your ship, because I think that's probably the most relevant factor. But effectively what they're doing is they're mapping delta V. And delta V is the inherent ability of your ship to change its velocity, how much it can change its velocity. The way to think about that is, if you don't change your velocity at all, and you're sitting on Adalia Prime, you're obviously intuitively just going to stay on Adalia Prime. For you to get on this route and get to TN 28453, you have to change your velocity enough such that you get started on this transfer trajectory. And then once you arrive, you can also imagine if you didn't further change your velocity, you would just go flying off into space, maybe on some large elliptical orbit, but you would not end up at your destination. You would just fly right by it. So you also have to have enough of that change in velocity at your destination to slow down and actually stop on the rock that you want to get to. So what this is showing you is the total, how much you have to change your velocity to get away from your destination, and how much you have to change it to stop at your from your origin, and how much you have to change it to stop at your destination. And this shows you how that varies given two factors. One, how long you want to wait to leave, and the other is how long you want your trip to be. And it was pointed out, and it's correct, that this diagonal line you can see indicates equal trip times, or equal times to your destination. So anywhere along here would take the exact same amount of time to get from A to B. You just might stay at A a little bit longer, which is another thing that can play, I think, quite into strategy. If there is quite a long delay before your ideal route, it might make sense to not plan it right away, not start that trip right away, and instead do something else while you're waiting. And I think that will actually play quite a significant role in the strategy of shipping to and from market hubs, from your base, from your mining base, your productive base. And so they're really fascinating, because the orbital mechanics are not exactly simple. They make for some really interesting charts sometimes that have these little discontinuities. You can see here there's a section, a specific section in this pork chop plot where there's actually routes that are impossible, right next to routes that are actually fairly cheap. And it's always interesting to kind of click around there and see, what's happening. The fact that suddenly the only way to get there is to take these highly inclined trajectories and make it to the point where they're just too expensive to go. And then you go a little bit further, and suddenly they're much more convenient again. So it packs a ton of information. And in fact, we are generating, this chart is actually showing you one generated route, and the delta V associated for every pair of departure delay days, or hours in this case, and flight time hours. So they're actually 365 squared trajectory solutions. We use a solver called a Lambert solver to calculate all of those. So at the end of the day, it's really cool because we're effectively figuring out how to travel around Adalia in exactly the same way, with a few minor exceptions to like JPL and NASA, which I think is awesome. And like Sergey said, I think it's incredibly unique. It's not a mechanic that, as far as I'm aware, is really in any multiplayer game. So I'm really excited to see how that presents itself and all of the incredibly interesting dynamics and strategies that will grow out of that.
I was having some fun playing around with this earlier, and I picked 2 highly inclined asteroids that don't have very good lineup of like orbital periods and things like that. And it was interesting to see, you know, like there's basically one opportune time in their orbits that you can even reach each other, whereas like the chart that you're looking at on screen right now, like there's just so much space. You know, you can find the time quite easily, but not all asteroids are going to be like that. You know, there's going to be plenty of asteroids that have, you know, very limited abilities to get to one another, and I think that's pretty cool.
And even like belt wide, if you're talking about 2 rocks across the belt from each other, even though we were just checking that yesterday, you should be able to, within 2 weeks, reach a lot of places. But there's a handful of places that require a little bit more planning. They're a little bit further apart. Might require a pit stop midway to refuel. I'll go into just real quick too to mention the UI. The 5 points in this UI that matter, that are covered in this graph. That's kind of important because they show the time delay. So whenever Chris right here is picking around at different points. So what happens, the points on the 3D view that a single route simulates, there is the origin asteroid, and there's the origin asteroid at time 0, which is actually, you know, it's kind of difficult to see. I actually think I'm going to make that icon a little bit brighter now in retrospect. But there is Adalia Prime at time 0. There is Adalia Prime at time of launch, because there's a delay built into this. This means like, hey, you're waiting for a little bit more opportune lineup. Then you launch at that icon. Then you travel along the route, and that little green icon, that this is a 5th location, which is kind of for fun, but that little green arrow of route is exactly halfway through the route. And for our torch ships, that's the flip and burn part. This is where the ship flips around and begins decelerating. And so you're traveling along this route, and you reach your destination actually at a future time. So that destination there is offset by the time of the flight. And then the 5th and final location is destination time at time 0, which is, you know, minorly irrelevant, but it just to shows you that that's where that bright green arc is. That's how long your destination travels while alongside of your ship, basically while your ship is flying there.
Yeah, and I think those are really helpful because it's interesting. A lot of times you'll look at routes that are cheap, but still fairly quick, and they look long. And it's kind of it's sort of not intuitive that they look long, but the reality is that, you know, there might be 2 asteroids that are never really all that far apart, but you're just kind of slowly floating between them while the 3 of you orbit around Adalia at the same time. And that's why ultimately they end up being cheap and propellant efficient routes. So I think all of those different components help to kind of add a little bit more intuitiveness back to that.
Yeah,
And yeah, I just showed also. I don't know if everybody was watching, but you can also fast forward and rewind. Rewind is probably less relevant, but you can fast forward to a time in the future for like multi-hop jumps. So if you want to plan a route, understand how far in the future that is, then plan another route after you've arrived, it's very possible. You know, you can fast forward to that point in the future after you've arrived and plan your next step. So in that way,
is quite useful too. I'll add in certain case. Carry on.
No, yeah. So I mean, it's really flexible in that you can kind of plan these routes. at any time in the future, and you can plan, quite extensive itineraries for, your trade routes. Maybe your trade routes actually hit 4 different asteroids in some sort of cycle. You could plan that out just by fast forwarding and taking a look at the pork chop plot at each step.
Yep, and for the rewinding case, when that's actually useful is if you were looking for asteroids that will be easy for you to get to from a current asteroid. Um, One thing you could do is you can click around and see what asteroids are close to me right now. But as it turns out, the asteroids that are close to you right now are actually often quite hard to get to because you're basically like catching up with them, or sort of having to decelerate to get to them. Like you're already like kind of looking at them too late in a way. The ones that you actually are easiest to get to are the ones that, if you rewind time a little bit, are the ones that are close to you a little while ago. Basically, so that's kind of what you want to see is, what rocks will be in an optimal trajectory for you at the present time. It started out that way a little bit earlier, so there's a good reason to want to rewind in some cases. So I think that I originally was thinking that we wouldn't be able to do these time controls, but I'm very much sold on it now.
Yeah, something I also want to bring up is like, okay, so this is awesome in my mind. It blows my mind just being able to play around with this. But what's the point of doing all of this other than it being really cool? The strategy of this, I think, is really going to determine like marketplace location and really good like bases for alliances, and where you on maybe a smaller solo rock are really going to want to travel to. And so I think this is where a lot of the like hubs or networks will start to develop from, is people playing around with this, being like, whoa, my asteroid's not very easily like aligned with Adalia Prime for flights. So you know what? 104, let's check that. And then all of a sudden you realize 104 is vastly superior in terms of flight times for you, and usage of fuel, and that's where you start to plan out. Like I know the First Alliance has kind of been talking about this, but like constellations, and you start to get like networks of like where you might go get gas for multi-hops, where you might want to go as your main hub for picking up certain goods, and where maybe metals or volatiles will end up more often than not due to kind of flight constraints. Proto, I see you're unmuted, but I want to say also, like, we have about 10 more minutes. If there's questions that people want to ask that haven't already come up, feel free to type them in, and we can respond to those. All right, you're up here on stage. Feel free to chime in here.
Thanks, guys. So I'm kind of just looking at this. Are you able to change the ship type as well? I feel like the light transport is something that a lot of people are going to be using right off the gate to get to their asteroids that they've purchased to kind of get things set up. Is that kind of set up right now where you guys can change the ship type and that player to light transport?
We got all the specs for the 3 ships in there. So it just happens to default to shuttle, but yeah, if you want to practice with the light transport, and actually that's a good point, that the graph is totally different, because it's got, you set up your propellant accordingly. The tanks are a little bit different. The shuttle is the one that has the longest reach of all the ships.
Yeah, and to be clear, this UI is there's kind of 2 modes to it. This is the simulate flight mode, where you can basically make up a ship, make up what its propellant load is, what its cargo is, and then see what the pork chop plot looks like. Slightly different but related mode is the actual planning a route mode, where you start by selecting a ship, and then that is in orbit, and then you start planning your route. And in that case, the actual ship type and its cargo and propellant will all be pre-filled. You can't play with them. They'll just be what they are, and so that'll be whatever the reality of the situation is. This is for practicing and seeing, if I had this ship, at this time, at this place, what would the pork chop plots look like?
It seems like a lot of the routes, it's almost like you use up almost half the tank, so it's like almost every trip's almost just a one-way route, unless your destination's also got fuel or propellant.
You could see it that way. I mean, if you want to use all of your propellant to get somewhere and you're sure that it has propellant at the destination, you can do that. But typically, if you're going to like a little rock that doesn't have anything, you do need to save propellant to get home again. Keep in mind that you need less than half of your propellant to get home because of how delta V works. You get basically a lot more of your delta V when your ship is running on empty because the thrust doesn't change, but the mass of the ship is getting lower and lower as you use up propellant. So you actually get a lot higher acceleration during that last phase of the trip. So, if you want to use, 60 or 70% of your propellant to get somewhere, you're still going to have half the delta V potentially to get back again, depending on the actual numbers.
So you could actually reduce, like, for example, I mean, if we want to be conservative, we can actually you can actually take that simulated onboard propellant down, like what you have there or at max. So that's the amount of actual propellant that's on board, correct?
Yep, at the starting point.
Yeah. So
Yep,
you
at the
could, for
starting
example, like if you were going to a rock and you intended to leave empty, and you were using 60%, 67% of your propellant, obviously you'd be doing a different route on the way back. But you can kind of see that if you were to drop this, even just having 33% of your propellant, you actually have a more attractive torque drop plot than you did on the way out with 100% full propellant tanks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, this brings up an interesting point because at some point we had like kind of factored in, this like magical 50% mark, which means you have enough to complete a round trip. That is somewhere on this graph, and at one point, I thought about calling it out like special like line, especially fat line or something like that, that says, okay, at a certain point, the graph goes into the pink as it's more it gets to white actually as the most efficient routes. But there is a line somewhere that says, hey, this is efficient enough that it's less than 50%. But we've taken that out for now because I realized a lot. Yeah, it's just too difficult to plan out an entire round trip thing. And a lot of the times we surmised that the destination would have propellant on hand there, so like you should plan accordingly. There's a marketplace where you can fill up. That allows you to obviously go way faster, and also the amount you bring, right? So if you look at that that slider for a simulated propellant tank, you can slide it all the way to like max full tank mode. That gives you the max range you can possibly do on that ship. But if you want to just, the slider, I believe, starts at 50%. So if you look at that graph at 50% and imagine, it's not exactly how Delta V, not perfectly how Delta V works, right? Right, Proto. But if you put that tank somewhere at the 50% mark, you could be like, well, this is approximately what I need for a round trip, and then fill up your ship to full and do the rest.
I apologize. Kind of goes to a follow-up production question. I'm guessing, like, as far as making propellant, that's going to be made into, since it's required, like, I mean, these chips sound like it requires like tons and tons and tons of propellant, for just one little trip, for just one trip, one way. I'm guessing when it comes to actually making propellant, that'll be sold in, or when it comes like the factories, that'll be something that'll be kind of in a way massed. We'll be making lots of propellant with each like production cycle. Am I guessing? Am I say it correctly?
Yeah, I mean we're very cognizant that hydrogen specifically for propellant is going to be in huge demand. Looking at these graphs, it's pretty obvious. Like you're burning thousands of tons to get here and back again to almost any location. So clearly that needs to be heavily available in the belt. Part of what I'm doing with the balancing is to sort of take a look at what the actual needs might be of running an economy on this belt and sort of get some estimates of like how much actual hydrogen propellant might be needed to do that, and then balancing the spectral type abundances accordingly so that, for example, if we realize that hydrogen is just absurdly needed, okay, suddenly I types might be 80% hydrogen. It's like suddenly there might be a ton of hydrogen, that I've balanced to make the belts be a little bit more, sort of consistent with that amount of need. Obviously, we can also tune some numbers to bring that demand down a little bit. If it turns out that there's just more propellant being needed than we really want, we can actually make the ships a little bit more efficient, or there's various things we can do there to help that out in the other direction. Typically, we do want to make those two numbers sort of meet in the middle. We do want the amount of hydrogen available to sort of make sense for the amount that is needing to be used to get things around the belt.
Because it seems like to me that we're going to have to be I mean, the amount of hydrogen needed is going to be, or the amount of just propellant needed is going to, we're going to be able to produce massive amounts. And I mean, I'm curious how much propellant how many kilograms of propellant is produced in each cycle, and how long those production cycles are.
I mean, cycles isn't probably the right way to look at it. Like hydrogen itself is a raw material, so you use the extractor to produce it. And with the same mechanic that you've played with already in testnet phase 3, where you have to have a core sample with a deposit, and you start at the extraction and decide how much of that you want, and it gets slower towards the end of exhausting that deposit. Hydrogen propellant does actually have a few extra components in it, so you have to like assemble that together in a refinery to make the propellant. So that's again a process where you select how much of the output you want, and the amount of time that it takes determines that. We can make that fairly quick, and in fact we will, because it's not an energetically intense process. It's actually more sort of like packaging than anything. It's bringing together the tungsten and the silica that's needed for the nuclear rocket engines with cryo-cooled liquid hydrogen. And just sort of packaging them together, so that can actually happen quite quickly. So most of the time involved in getting hydrogen is coming from the extraction.
Okay, I mean, well, what I'm talking about, what I was referring to is the hydrogen propellant. Excuse me, because how much propellant is being used. So I'm just kind of curious. Like, well, you said you're going to actually come up with this number, so we'll be able to see. It's like, for example, every time we have a production cycle of hydrogen propellant, it produces, say, 1,000 kilograms or 10,000 kilograms per cycle. If
we decide that, like with extraction, there's a slider that says how much of this do you want to make, and it's between 0 and the maximum amount of time that you can run a process, which is I think like 2 real-life weeks or something. So anywhere between those two, you can select how much of it you want to make, and the inputs and outputs for that process are determined by the standard recipe for that process, which is what I've been working on.
Okay, I see. Okay. I see what you're saying. Okay, so the factory's going to be basically kind of follow the same way as the refineries, right?
Yep, all the production chain buildings more or less work the same. The farm is a slight exception in that it's kind of more batch based than the other ones. You'll see that when we describe it more in future, but they more or less all work the same.
Okay.
Fair enough. It's fair enough to say bare minimum, one extractor, one refinery, and then you're pretty much set up if you want a propellant farm of your own, right?
Yep, you'll have to import the tungsten and the silica, but that's fine.
Oh, okay. So, a couple things.
Yeah. So you can almost do it in almost
I-type.
Yeah, I mean, if you're on a CIS, you can possibly do the whole chain on a CIS.
Is that the case?
Yeah, I said it in chat, but I think the key here is that propellant is a huge part of the economy. It's the provides the entire ability to travel. It's our oil, and I think it's not necessarily a bad thing that it's the economy is so dependent on it, because it's going to be a very important piece. I think I have to imagine that the first settled asteroids will be oriented around being gas stations, and that will form like a pretty significant part of the backbone of getting around Adalian. I think it's a really fun component that is so often glossed over in other games, especially in other space games, where it's just sort of point and shoot and kind of get there through some sort of warp tunnel, but there's no real consideration to one of the most important parts of an economy.
Yep. I mean, a lot of this game is kind of logistics based. Making sure that you do your planning before you click the buttons and just go. Like, anybody who sets out to travel to somewhere and doesn't plan how to get there to get back will be having trouble getting back. That's like, we do want to have ways for them to do that, but it's going to be like, whoops, I messed up, and now I have to pay the price and take a long time to get back. So plan carefully before you do anything. Is sort of the name of the game here.
I apologize for taking some time here asking questions, but it's more so. So I guess back to the travel point. So with the because I feel like light transport's what people are going to be using a lot of to be able to getting set up, since the shuttles and the heavy transports required a actual a specific module or a specific building to be built on the asteroid in order to land them on the asteroid. So I feel like people are going to be moving the light transports around quite a bit. So, like in this case, you have here, it's already up. It's going to use 86% of the fuel that's in that tank right now. It's on board. And it's going to take 142 hours to get to that from Delia Prime to that Hero 1. Is that correct?
Yep. I mean, you can look at that diagonal line and actually to optimize a trip, we want to find the pinkest part of that diagonal line at any time to get a trip at the same time. So yeah, Chris just optimized that a little bit more, so it's 71%. But yeah, if you want to get there with zero cargo, that's what you've got to do. And what we're looking at here is actually two rocks that are very far apart, that are kind of at very different parts of the belt. One's a lot closer than the other. So typically there may be rocks like that that are actually quite hard to get to in one step. If you have a Trojan, getting to that from AP is going to be some work. And so it's that's part of what that rock is. It's more inaccessible. And so if you want to get materials out there, you're going to have to sort of plan things a little bit more carefully and potentially stop along the way to pick up propellant at an intermediate rock that is sort of intermediate between the semi-major axes of those two, to get materials there.
And I think that's like a huge opportunity, right? You build up a hub at that center point, provide fuel, ultimately build up into a market. So I think that those are the sorts of really interesting strategic decisions, tactical decisions that will drive a lot of the opportunity. And in the end, a lot of the built environment will reflect those decisions, which I think is really exciting.
Yeah, you would probably start by running a simultaneous search often. I'm realizing this now, by the way, and you would search for market orders, put hydrogen propellant in there. It will filter all asteroids that have some amount of hydrogen propellant in a marketplace for sale. That'll show you your gas stations. And then from there, you'll zoom out and be like, okay, what's near me? How do I get from point A to point B without, totally screwing myself and running out of fuel? But yes, I do agree that the fun, and I think a lot of your questions, I could already see the gears turning about initial colonization before the gas stations are built, before people have marketplaces set up. It will be and should be intentionally much harder before the belt is populated. Literally the Wild West rush. Things will probably be really hard early on.
Yeah, this was a point that I actually wrote into our new start here in the Discord. Was like, influence is not played in minutes and hours; it's played in months and years. And what I mean by that mostly is like, to set up an entire settlement on an asteroid should feel very rewarding, and it's going to take work. It's going to take time, and those who want to do it all on their own, it's going to take a significant amount of time and energy. Now, that's also where markets come into play. If you want to take quote unquote the short route and you have sway, then buy the things on marketplaces and import them more quickly, and you'll be off to the races. And what I love about that is, like, I think in most games people are like, oh, well, that'd be pay to win. It's like, well, you're buying things from other players. So it's actually quite rewarding, I think, for those who have spent the time and effort to deliver those goods to the marketplaces.
I'm glad you went to this example here that you're on now, because you're showing like a route that's like, I think these, and it showed the difference between the two asteroids, and it does take in consideration like this one here, the pork chop plot. It's like really bright, like it's pretty good. You can actually get there pretty fast if you'd like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely, and there will be quite a few asteroids. I mean, around any given asteroid, there will be a lot of them that are cheap to get to, and I think it's going to be all about kind of finding those asteroids that serve as good waypoints between origins and destinations.
All you guys said is like the best. It sounds like it's the most fuel efficient of the three right now.
Sorry, I missed the first part.
So it seems like the shuttle can get the furthest out of the three ships right now.
Yeah, it can.
Yeah, it's the least massive of the three, and it also has the lowest cargo capacity. So those two things together mean that the propellant fraction is actually higher than any of the other ships, and that means higher delta V. So that's why the shuttle can get there faster.
Yeah,
Comparing those to like an empty and fully filled propellant tank, light transport or heavy transport, it's not that much faster. It just
Right,
takes
if you have
that
an
much
empty
more
one.
propellant.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was. We were talking about this on a team meeting the other day, but just the like the realism here, and like how much cargo to propellant, the ratio here, like in game is already pretty vastly different than what like the reality was. Chris had mentioned that the payload factor for the Apollo mission was 1.5% of propellant mass, and here I think it's Chris. What is it? 1-to-1 essentially.
Yes, 1-to-1.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
we do realize this is a game. It needs to be fun, and we are balancing these things. And the numbers you see on the screen aren't final. But at the same time, I think the challenge here is space is really large, and getting things from point A to point B in space is going to require a lot of fuel. And so, I think a lot of the dynamics and strategy of this game is based around fuel, and I think that's actually really exciting. And it means the I types and the Trojans are quite useful in the grand scheme of things. As this game builds out and has lots more players, there's just going to be a massive need for fuel all the time.
Um, and it sounds, and from what I guess from this call, it's like it seems like the CIS is going to be pretty. Some CIS is going to be served as good gas or be nice little gas stations because they can pretty much do the full. I think from what I've gathered on the production chain on Illyrium's site is that you can pretty much do the full production chain for hydrogen propellant um, on a CIS.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. The tungsten comes from pyroxene, and the silica comes from olivine, both of which are available on CIS. Keep in mind though that the densities of all of those materials will be less than on the single spectral type of any of them. So if you want to get a lot of hydrogen, you probably want to do that on an I type, not a CIS type. To fully build out that asteroid. If you want to get a lot of those other things, you'll need to do that on an S type instead. So there's always trade-offs there.
So we are quite a bit past time here right now, and I don't want to cut things off. I know everyone here, though, is working on some pretty large projects, so I think we need to wind this down. I do see one question that I just want to make sure that I answer. Juice, the launch of exploitation, no date changes or anything have been called out, so we're still planning on, towards late summer, things like that. For launch of exploitation. If anything changes around that, we will absolutely let everyone know, but that's what we're working towards, and things are looking good right now. Chris, is there any final closing statements you want to make, or anything you want to call out, or give any intro to people of when they might expect this in the client for them to play around with?
This will be in the client as soon as we can get through our Cairo 0 to Cairo 1 transition, which we are in earnest now. So I can't give a specific date yet, but we're working away at it as quickly as possible.
So thank you everyone for coming. If you have more questions, which I'm sure you do because now you've seen flight and our travel in this game, and it's quite thought-provoking, feel free to let us know in the general chat. We'll get back to you. Thank you guys for coming. I'll get this here on YouTube soon so that you can review that. I'm crossing my fingers that the video and everything is working, and I think it's going to go a lot smoother for the next round. So again, thank you guys. If you want to be part of the ACC, do remember to get that in before the end of the month. And for the community survey, if you haven't already taken that, that would be fantastic if you guys could do that. Links are in the announcements channel.
Also, I've got a little poll going in general about a nerdy question, if anybody wants to check that out.
Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, have a good day, everyone.
Take care.
That's good.
Have a good
Thanks,
one.
everyone.